Hello, I'm Geuer-Pollmann. It is May the 23rd, 2019, and I wanted to record a quick session on how to host a Spring Boot application on top of Azure, set up a pretty simple form of continuous integration, have people sign in via Azure Active Directory, and also use SQL Azure in the back in a secure way. The code for this prototype you can find on my GitHub repository, which is under my username chgeuer, and then kind of the thing called Spring Boot AAD key vault. So when I navigate to that page, I am looking. So currently the code base that I'm playing with is commit number 7f something. So this is basically the code base that we are playing around with. So first of all, let's have a quick look around how particularly this repository behaves or what we are going to demonstrate. So this is the overall architecture of the system. So simply speaking, we want to have this green thing in the middle, a Spring Boot application, and I want to host this on an Azure container instance, which means I need to have a Docker container to run this instance. So the flow from the deployment perspective is like this. We have a source code base down here on my laptop, which I've pushed to GitHub in step number 1. Each time I push to GitHub, I want a notification being sent into Azure in step number 2, where somebody, in our case, an Azure Container Registry, is going to build it in step number 3. Azure Container Registry is, in the simplest form, basically a repository where I can store Docker images, but in addition to this, it also has a capability where we can define so-called tasks. And such a task can be, hey, when there is a new version of the software in GitHub, basically takes a software, build a new version, and this is step number 3. So once we have a compiled Docker image with our Spring Boot application in our container registry, we want an Azure to bring up an Azure container instance up here, which basically in step number 4 pulls this image and brings the whole thing up. So that's kind of the deployment part of the story. When we look into the actual interaction with the system, we have a user who basically in step number 5 hits our Spring Boot endpoint. That Spring Boot application is currently not defined in with funky UI or something like that, but it's configured to immediately redirect into Azure Active Directory, step number 6, so that the user can authenticate an Azure AD for that particular relying party. And in step number 7, the user then gets redirected into the Spring Boot application. And the Spring Boot application uses a token which was provided by the user in step 8 to pull in additional information such as group membership and so on. So now the application, after step 8 finished, the application knows who the user is. It then needs to talk to the Azure SQL Azure database, or whatever we call it these days, a Microsoft managed SQL Server instance. And therefore it needs a connection string. In order to avoid storing the connection string alongside with the web application, the connection string is an Azure Key Vault, so we need to fetch it from there. So the Azure Container Instance needs to itself fetch a token from Azure Active Directory in step 9 to be authorized to talk to Key Vault in step 10, fetch the connection string, and then finally hit the SQL database and then return the result to the user. So that is the actual flow of information. And so the next thing we are going to do is inside this repository, there is a script, and currently the script is create infra. This is basically a shell script. And in this shell script, by the way, also there are no secrets, nothing checked into this repository here. So in the next step, we will interactively be running the contents of this create infra thing step by step to actually create our infrastructure. So let's close these pointers. I opened the repository or the Git repository in Visual Studio Code. Down here I have a terminal window, and I'm here in the Windows subsystem for Linux. So I basically have an interactive Linux shell where I can say, show me what's up here and so on. So here we have our create infra, and I will simply basically run this script line by line. So the Azure Active Directory tenant that we're playing with is my custom Azure AD tenant, chgoya FTE full-time employee at on Microsoft.com. That's basically my tenant ID. The data center in which we are going to run will be Western Europe. And before we start, let's quickly navigate to the Azure portal into the resource groups collection. And there we have 5 resource groups, but not the one which we want to create in which all these things live. So we want to create a resource group, and also let's quickly have a look in Azure Active Directory. So this is my Azure AD tenant, and inside that AD tenant in the app registrations pane, we basically, oh, there's just a leftover from a previous session. Sorry for that. Let's just kill this one. Remove this service principal, and actually we can also delete this one because I forgot the password anyway. So now, and actually while we're at it, just delete everything and then we're good to go. So we have no application registrations here, no service principals, no nothing. So all the things we create belong to us. So the first thing in the is we need a resource group. Actually, so the resource group we want to call Spring Demo. So let's set this variable, and let's also use a prefix. You will see later that prefix is basically used for naming resources. So we are going to go in this directory, run Spring Demo in Western Europe. Just one thing which I forgot. So I have in Azure Active Directory, I've created a group, a users group, which I called Christian. And the reasoning behind this group is that all the different identities which I have, my business identities and my foreign identities and so on, they all kind of are in the same group. So essentially that group is contains 7 members, but in essence it's just one human being which has access to this particular group. And this is a group which we will be using later. Let me just zoom out a little bit here. So here now we are naming a bunch of things. So basically I'm using the prefix with the character SQL to say. So when I say here echo $SQL server name, Spring Demo SQL will be essentially the name of our server instance for SQL Azure. So the first thing we do is we create the resource group. So Azure, using the AZ command line, AZ is Azure's CLI. We basically say create a resource group with a certain name in a certain location. So this will now spin up a resource group here in Western Europe. It's actually not yet created. So once a resource group exists, the next thing we will do is we will generate 2 passwords. We need one password for the SQL Server database, and we need one password or one secret credential for the service principal. Actually, now here you can see that resource group creation was finished. So I just create a simple folder here locally in my instance. I use OpenSSL to create some password, and I also write that password down here. So this will be the SQL instance password subsequently. And we also create a service principal password. Now we're there. As I mentioned previously, you might remember in step number, let's go to the README and let's go back to the README or to the picture. You might remember in step number 8, the Spring Boot application needs to be able to talk to Azure Active Directory and validate the group memberships of this particular user. And this is why it needs access to the Azure AD Graph API, and it needs to have the capability to sign in and read user profiles. So these are some magic GUIDs from our documentation. And I'm basically just creating a simple JSON file here, this manifest JSON, which contains these descriptions here. So that's it. So the first thing is we are going to say Azure Active Directory application create. So I create or I register a new application called demo principal with a symmetric key, and here we will be setting the secret key, or not the secret key, well, actually the secret key which you generated previously. And given the fact that we will be hosting that thing on an Azure container instance, let me quickly echo $. So the host name where we are going to host this thing later, that must be recorded in the reply URLs, will be Spring Demo Azure Container Instance in Western Europe. So, and when this command returns, it creates a bunch of JSON. And with this query app ID, I basically fetch the application ID programmatically out of the response. And also you see here the manifest JSON, or the add manifest JSON basically points to our description. So this here is a single command. And when we run this one, it now talks to Azure AD and creates or registers an application. So we can navigate in the back. By the way, let's see it, just refresh. Here's now our Spring Demo resource group. That's great. And when we go to Azure AD, we should also be seeing the application showing up under the app registration. So let's have a quick look here. And the app registrations. And here we have the Spring Demo service principal. And this 8841 something should be now the application ID which we got back. That's great. And let's also just write the application ID here down to our, and we don't need the manifest JSON. The next thing is inside the manifest for this Azure AD application down here. When I look into the manifest configuration, you can see that currently it is being defined with a sign-in audience of Azure Active Directory my.org. So only users from that particular organization can sign in. So users who live in the Geuer FTE Azure AD. But I want to change this so that also users from other organizations, from other Active Directory tenants, can sign in. And I'm doing so by updating my application ID and say that this application is also available to other Azure AD tenants by saying available to other tenants equals true. So this will basically change the sign-in audience down here. Let's give it a second until this call goes through. And so this means at that point in time, our web application, assuming it lives somewhere, that web application would be able to allow users to sign in, so it can basically consume tokens after the fact. So let's quickly go here to I haven't figured out how I can simply reload the manifest. Now I go back into the manifest, scroll down to the bottom and down. Actually, that didn't work. Let's go to the app registrations. Let's go into this app again. That is some browser refresh problem which I'm having here. Now we can see the sign-in audience is Azure AD multiple orgs. So for example, I can also use my Microsoft work account to sign in to this particular application. And that's cool. The next thing is we create a service principal out of this application. So we convert it or promote it to be a service principal. So for example, we can write policy in Key Vault on it. Up to now, and also we need to grant this service principal permissions to use the Azure AD Graph API. This is the Azure AD app permission grant. So up till this point, we only have created basically a single object in Azure AD, and that's pretty much it. So this means our resource group down here, if we navigate to the resource group in the Resource Explorer, no, in the resource group section, our Spring Boot demo resource group is yet completely empty because we haven't created any resources. That will change now, because in the next step we will create the Azure SQL Server. So we say SQL Server create in the given resource group in the given location, and the username will be, and the password, this is the ones which we defined a couple of seconds ago upstairs, so to say. And because if you, in case you want to, while this provisions, let's quickly have a look at some other things down here. Because you can also host that application on your laptop. So I basically allow, I basically make it possible that you can run that Docker build command locally on your laptop and also host it locally. And the things which we then need to get into the system are our Azure AD tenant ID, the client ID, and the secret, the Azure Active Directory group, which we allow the users to be in, and the address of the key vault so it can talk to the back. And currently it exposes port 8080. Now in the meantime, our SQL Server database exists. So when we refresh the view down here in the resource group, as you can see nothing. That can't be. There it is. Here we have our SQL Server. So on top of that SQL Server, we are now going to create a database. In case you want to run that stuff from your laptop, by default, the firewall rules for the SQL instance are locked down so that you can only talk to the SQL instance from Azure hosted services. In case you want to also do this from your laptop, you basically can set a firewall rule where you include your IP range or a specific IP address and selectively open the firewall for this one. In this case, I have a pretty unselective rule, which basically says that every imaginable IP address is authorized to talk to this machine. So you can also see these things here when I go into the SQL instance. You know, it's basically everything you do in the console, you can also do here in the portal. And when we look, where is this down here in firewalls? There is indeed a firewall rule with a marvelous name, don't do that in production, which contains our broad IP range. We could also actually selectively just add the current IP address. This is my local IP address down here in Germany, in Düsseldorf. So now we would simply allow one very specific IP address to hit the instance. The next thing, now that the server exists, we create a small toy database. So inside that server, we create a database with a database name and a specific service objective basic, which is kind of the SQL Azure equivalent of a Raspberry Pi, so to say. The next thing is, while this is running, we will be having two helper functions here. So this helper function here creates a connection string. So this is a JDBC connection string where we record the server, the database, the username, the password, and all these things basically in a big connection string. This is a Spring connection string function which gets server, database, user, and password. And the other thing is, like in Spring Boot, in Spring Boot, properties have the form spring.datasource.url, which would be our connection string to the database. Unfortunately, Azure Key Vault doesn't allow us to use, keys for keys, in the key value pair. To use dots in the key, it must be dashes. And that's why I have here a small bash function, which basically converts all dots in a pattern into dashes. So these are the Spring property name to key vault name and the Spring connection string functions. So let's quickly bring these into the shell scope as well. And now it's time to create the key vault. So if you remember back in the picture, we now created an object down here in Azure AD, and we now created the SQL database. In the next step, we create our Azure Key Vault. So in Azure Key Vault, actually enabled for deployment, disk encryption, and template deployment, I actually can or could delete these 3 lines. They are not really relevant for our scenario here. Just create a standard SKU of Key Vault. And once that exists, we need to authorize our application ID, our service principal. So we say Key Vault set policy, and we authorize that service principal to list the available secrets and to fetch an individual secret. So this is exactly the permission needed in step number 10. So after our application authenticates to Azure AD and fetches a token for Key Vault in step number 9, when it presents that token in step number 10, Key Vault needs to know that this particular service principal, the Spring Boot application, is authorized to list keys and to fetch keys in Key Vault. So we now set the permission on the Key Vault by saying AZ Key Vault set policy. And once that's done, we actually inject the concrete connection string, which is a secret, into Key Vault. So the name is basically spring-data source-URL. That's what I use my little converter function for. And the value is a full connection string. So if we would be running, if we would, for example, now here echo the connection string, you can see here it contains the username, the password, and also the demo thing. So now we store the connection string in Azure Key Vault. While this is happening, we can quickly reload the resources on the resource view here. So now you can see we have our SQL Server. On top of that, we have a SQL database, and we have a Spring demo Key Vault. And inside that Key Vault, when we go into the access policies, we can see that the Spring demo principal has a couple of permissions on the Key Vault, specifically the get and the list permissions. The next thing is we need an Azure Container Registry. So let's quickly trigger this thing. So the Azure Container Registry, if you remember, was that thing down here, which can not only store Docker images which we push to it, but it can also build Docker images with a build task, and we will use that build task subsequently. So when we refresh, we now also have our Spring Demo Azure Container Registry sitting in the same data center. Now, actually, let's do one thing. We fetch one of the 2 Azure Container Registry passwords, because we need this in order for the task to be able to store Docker images. Great. So the image name which I came up with is called Spring AD. Build. Let's rename this. Somebody, let me just quickly hit the pause. So the next step is, in this Azure Container Registry, we create a task called Build Spring AAD. And this task means, or is defined to fetch the source code from my repository in the master branch, use a Docker file to create an image. So let's shoot this off. So from now on, each time I push to my GitHub repository, that task will this task inside the Azure Container Registry will kick off and build the latest Docker image and tag it not only with the sequence number of the concrete run ID, but also with the latest tag. Please note I provided an access GitHub token here to the Azure Container Registry to register itself in for a webhook here. And so when we now navigate back into our resource group inside the Azure Spring Demo Azure Container Registry, we can go to the tasks pane, and there are currently no tasks running. And what we do now is we trigger an initial image build. So I say Azure Container Registry run the specific task at hand. And so when I refresh here, actually we don't need to refresh because we should see the output from that task in our local console. So the output from that task, it basically, so it's queued now with a certain build ID, container builder number 1. It's waiting for an agent to do what we want to do. And so it now fetched the source code from GitHub, and it's using our Docker file. While this is running is a good time to look into what the Docker file actually does. The Docker file is a multi-stage build for Spring Boot. So if essentially we are starting with the first image layer, the first image is, which I called Gradle, is essentially an updated JDK image with the Gradle tool in it. From that I inherit and create a build image where I copy my source code in, and in line number 13, which happens now actually on our instance, run the actual compile process. So this is where my main jar is being created. And then we have a plain vanilla Alpine, OpenJDK Alpine image where I copy the Azure AD jar, so the Spring Boot self-contained jar from the build image up here, copy that AAD001 snapshot jar into our application directory together with a small prepare shell script. Actually, I'm not sure. I got this from a sample. I'm not even sure if this is relevant or not. And this then will be our executable application. That process here, that compile process, still takes, oh no, actually compilation is finished. So we should simply wait for a second until the image is completely created, because then we can continue with our infrastructure preparation and create our running container instance. And this is actually the last step we need to take from a deployment perspective. So to quickly walk you through this one, so we say we want to create a container instance. The DNS label means it will not only have some public IP address, but it will have our concrete host name, which we defined previously. In Western Europe, using an image from the container registry. And you might remember I fetched the Azure Container Registry password. So when I echo this password, echo this one, this is actually one of the two passwords which we have here in our container registry. By the way, quickly, let's have a look here. So in our tasks list, we should be seeing that the build Spring AAD finished, and that was manually triggered from the command line. So now Let's kick off the infrastructure and bring up the container. Boom. So just to understand, actually, so my web application is currently hosted on port 8080 on a public IP address, and the information which we want to pass in is we need to tell the application like in which Azure AD tenant the credentials belong to. The credentials are our client ID, our application ID, and the password. Please note that I have public environment variables and secure environment variables, which means these are not displayed in the UI. We have the and the Active Directory group, which I allow the application to pull membership for, and the actual key vault URL where the SQL connection string is living. So once this is done, we will be having a public endpoint running and we will be able to hit the application. Let's quickly navigate back to our resource group, refresh and see what we have. So here we can already see a container instance running, our ACI. In the container instance, in the containers section, we can, it seems to be already running. That's great. So let's have a look at the properties. So the properties which we brought in, we tell it like here you can find the key vault. This is the directory in which you live in. This is your kind of username or your client ID. And because it was a secret property, we can see the password value in here. And when we look in the logs, and I hope we don't see any strange things in here. When we see in the logs, it now needs to connect to some backend service and pull the container logs. But actually, it's certainly more interesting to anyhow look at the running instance. So in the overview, like Spring Demo ACI in Western Europe is our machine. So let's hit this endpoint. And what you notice is, without further ado, it redirected me to Azure Active Directory. So inside Azure Active Directory, you can now see I'm currently signed in with my work account. And it asks me whether I want to authorize a Spring Demo principal to sign me into that application and read my profile from Azure AD. And when I allow this, it redirects me back into the application. And now we are kind of in Java space land. And this, what I do here, so kind of the slash endpoint is essentially welcoming me and say that I am apparently in the Christian Azure AD group. And just for me, as a kind of debug mechanism, I was spitting out the full SQL Azure DB connection string in here. Let's now look into the actual Java Spring Boot source code, which might be interesting. So the demo application, I mean, this is just a kind of the skeleton which came out of the Spring Boot generator. The SQL classes here are, actually, let me copy this thing because I don't know SQL, so I need to remember how this works. The repository is essentially just a JDBC type of thing which can talk to a relational database. And pet is a small data structure for a name and species and unique ID. The really interesting thing is the hello controller. So inside the hello controller, we brought in, we have the IOC container to wire up our pet repository, because this is kind of the thing which allows us to talk to the database. And the first web method we have in here is some Christian method, which is hooked up to the path /. And in line 33, you can see the pre-authorize attribute, which validates that I'm in a certain role, the has role Christian type of thing. Actually, before we continue, let's quickly look in the application configuration, in the application properties. In here, you can see the first four properties, the Azure Active Directory tenant ID, I'm taking out of the Docker containers environment. That's why I passed them down into the environment. You might remember here in create infra, I push these 5 environment variables into the Docker container. And here I'm reading these inside the Docker container. So I have the Azure AD tenant ID, the groups, the client ID, and the secret. These 4 settings are necessary for validating inbound user requests. I am reusing the client ID and the client secret also for the Azure Key Vaults, client ID and client key. And this is where the 5th parameter, the Key Vault URI, slips in. And I'm specifying that I always want to initialize the database. So if the schema is not yet there, the schema is here. It's basically create a table pet with a name and a species. And the driver is the MS SQL driver. That's why this thing here is called schema MS SQL. So back to the hello controller. So inside the hello controller, I'm basically spitting out the connection string. And this here is interesting. So this is not configured on the source code side of things. And Spring Boot says, okay, I can't find this setting anywhere, but apparently I have a Key Vault provider. So let's give it a try. Replace these things by dashes and pull, let's replace these things here by dashes. And then try if we have a key or a secret in Azure Key Vault, which corresponds to this thing. So this is how the repository actually gets a connection string to the underlying database. So the pass slash just validates that I'm in the role Christian, and that's why it's saying, hey, you are apparently in the Christian Azure AD group. The next endpoint which I have is called claims. And the claims endpoint tells me all the different claims which were in the security token, like I am in the role Christian, I'm a certain subject, all in one something. I authenticated with multi-factor authentication. The issuer is the Microsoft Azure AD. The audience is our application here. This is my full name, my IP address, and my unique name, my email address, so to say. So that's what we can see in the claims endpoint. So the claims endpoint can be hit by anybody who is authenticated. And for that, we simply grab the security contacts authentication information and spit out the principal information. And now to validate that we're actually talking to the database, let's hit the /pet endpoint, which iterates over all entries in our database. So when we hit pet, our database is empty, which is not a big surprise because we just created it. So let's do something funky and let's go to the database. For that to happen, I need my SQL password, which was generated by OpenSSL. Let's go to the resource group. Let's go to the database. And inside the database, let's hit the query editor. So I could authorize my Active Directory account, chgoya@microsoft.com, also to talk Azure AD single sign-on to the database, but that didn't yet happen, so I just punch in the password, and we are now basically on a SQL prompt inside the database. And now I just need to look at my cheat sheet inside the pet repository. How does an insert statement look like? It looks like so. Insert into pet. And the values, I think this is not needed. And the value is dog. And that is mama, I guess, right? And shark is fish. And we also run this one. And when I now refresh that endpoint, we basically see here the entries, or when we pull for a certain entry, like entry number 1, or entry number 2, we would be seeing these. And I think that is pretty much it from my side. I hope that all made sense, and let's talk soon.